Hi, I'm Novelette Witt with Morgen Real Estate. California has seen many changes over the past decades, and to have a better understanding of those changes, especially how it affects the South Bay cities, we've invited Greg Williams, who is the director of Gerth Archives and Special Collections at the Library of CSU Dominguez Hills, to share some of the city's past and what we could learn from it. Hi, Greg. What can you tell us has changed over the past 20, 30 years in the South Bay area?
There's been basically in the South Bay, it's not necessarily an effort, it's just what's happened is that whatever free land was there 30, 40 years ago, it's pretty much being used up. For instance, across the highway, across the 405, there's a large set of land that was used as a garbage dump in Carson for many, many years. It's also always been, recently in the last 30 years, been slated as a potential football stadium. And so 25 years ago, the Raiders were looking at the site in Carson. Instead of that, we got the Dignity Health Field Park in 2000. In 2000, we got that on this campus. It used to be the Home Depot Center, then StubHub, and now it's Dignity Health Park. It's where the Galaxy play and the Chargers play. And there's always been this interest in the South Bay of trying to get sports teams here. In fact, in the late 1950s, they tried to get the Dodgers and the Angels to come into this area. And the same is with Inglewood, where they're building the stadium off the Rams Stadium on land that used to be oil refineries or something along those lines. So the other aspect, especially in Carson, is land that used to be completely blank is now land that they use for warehouses. So there's an enormous amount of warehouses just behind my shoulder on this thing. And it varies. It evolves from residential housing in the 50s and the 60s to other multi-use properties in the 2000s, 2015s. But the basis of all this land in a large part of the South Bay was something called the Rancho San Pedro. The Rancho San Pedro was the land grant given to a Dominguez family member in the 1780s. It stayed in the family until the late 19th century. Then it divided up amongst Dominguez family members. Some family members got beach areas, some family members got hilly areas, other lowlands. The Dominguez family sold the land that started Torrance. They sold the land that started Compton. They sold the land that brought the railroad to the port, and still Dominguez family resident relatives have parts of the land around here. They were trying to sell the land that Dominguez Hill is on in the late 1950s, and that's when they were interested in having the Dodgers or the Angels come here, or a World's Fair that never happened. They were just active real estate people trying to get boosterism in this area. And so that's one of the stories of how this land it hasn't really grown as much as it expanded inward, or there's been reuse. Land that used to be vacant or land that used to have certain industries on it is now evolved into other industries. The fact that so much residential land came through in the 50s and the 60s resulted in other things as a result of that. The fact that the Watts riots or Watts Rebellion took place in 1965 led to this campus being placed here as opposed to all over the South Bay. And the location of this campus is sort of a metaphor for how we used the South Bay. There were 40 different locations in the South Bay, from El Segundo to San Pedro, that they were looking at. This campus's first name was Cal State Palos Verdes. The first campus for one semester or 1 year was in Rolling Hills. They moved across the street from where I'm sitting right now to start Cal State Dominguez Hills in 1966. All that it comes from the history, but people are not necessarily, it's LA, they're not thinking about the history very much, but there is definitely some history behind all that. I think in the last 30 or 40 years, a lot has happened in regards to the government being involved in placing certain industries and whatnot in certain areas. The real estate companies came into Torrance. There was an opening in Carson for a lot of land, and that was filled in probably the 60s and the 70s. And so, yeah, that's...
Fascinating, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that with us. So then, have you seen any significant changes that might have impacted the South Bay cities in general, negative or positively?
I think the most interesting thing is how certain the area, how the area has developed, with like Manhattan Beach being completely redone by people with the means to redo it. Torrance is a pretty stable place. Palos Verdes is obviously a more wealthy area, but it's interesting how when you think of west of the 405, you think a lot about residential, although that's not entirely true, because there is the oil industry, the refinery industry all over the place, and that's an interesting dynamic in that folks are becoming more and more aware of the environment and the effects of living near oil refineries and whatnot, and how do you mitigate that? Because, for instance, Torrance is a residential area surrounded by oil industry items, and Wilmington gets a larger brunt of that. So it's that's a new and interesting dilemma that folks are going to have to face. It has to be safe for their children to grow up in, and you can see the effects of environmental degradation, near railroad tracks, near where other industry has been in the past, and it hasn't, the cleanup hasn't happened, the mitigation hasn't happened. And that is still relevant in some of the poorer areas, Wilmington and Watts and Compton. And even those areas are evolving, they're changing, they're very, that environmental past is catching up with folks, and it needs to be mitigated. And it's been mitigated in other places, so it's time to be mitigated in those areas. The South Bay is a fascinating experiment in both suburbia and industry, and how it handles that is the key to the future. And we here at Dominguez Hills hope to provide the workforce for that, not only in the industries that are relevant, but the port and how that progresses in the future. So yeah, we've been moving along, and so yeah.
Okay, lovely. So then, so based on what we know of the past, what are some of the driving forces that we could apply moving forward?
I think with the population of LA County growing as it has, I think one aspect that we'll see, whether it's a good or bad aspect, you can take a look at certain neighborhoods in Orange County that used to be single housing neighborhoods they're taking out like 3 houses and they're putting in 50 houses or 50 condos or 50 apartments. And that high density type of housing is something that may come here. I think that would be okay for certain areas and sort of too bad from a preservation standpoint, in that way I'd like to see the housing that was here initially continue to be used for single residential housing, but we have to house the population, and there's a lot of land in this area that can be used efficiently, and after that the single family house is also, you know, important to the quality of life of the whole area. And we're talking about a very large area that Mr. Dominguez, when he came here in the 1700s, couldn't imagine, because, you know, all there was scrub and cattle and a few people wandering around, and the Native Americans who were on this land for centuries before that.
Thank you, Grant. Really appreciate you being here today.
Oh, thank you for coming in, and I'm glad you could see our campus, and you're welcome.
Thanks, Grant.